My name is Lena Harrington, 32, the middle child everyone forgot to notice. When I walked up the flagstones to the Harrington house that Thanksgiving, I felt the old muscle memory of stepping into a place built more for appearances than for people. The wreath on the door was perfect. The hedges were clipped like little green soldiers. The house smelled faintly of lemon polish and cinnamon from the kitchen. I wore a black dress that said polished and private, and under the fabric a steady pulse of something the family had never learned to measure: quiet, furious competence. From the outside, our lives looked flawless. My grandfather, Arthur Harrington, had started Harrington Systems in 1979 in a small garage with an oddball idea about inventory software. He took that idea and turned it into a regional legend. My father, Victor Harrington, took the company and turned it into their kind of empire: big offices, bigger clients, a boardroom where deals were sealed with a particular look and a crisp handshake. Holidays at the Harringtons always came with a side of market analysis. There were three of us. Ethan, 38, the eldest, got the easy seat. He'd majored in communications, charmed his way through college, and waltzed into an executive role the day after graduation. He loved the perks more than the work: yachts, invitations, and the sense of being the one who mattered. Chloe, 29, the youngest, built an entire career out of curated sunlight and designer coffee. She turned our family name into aesthetic content, and people loved it. I was Lena, 32, who learned to write code before most kids learned to tie their shoes, and watched my ideas vanish in boardrooms where my voice slid off the men around the table like water off waxed wood. Dad adored telling the story of how he built the company, and every holiday meal became a rerun of his successes. He never failed to remind anyone within earshot which side of the ledger mattered most. Mother, Eleanor, came from old money and kept the peace by pouring another glass of white wine and smoothing conversation like a practiced hostess. She loved us. She loved the house. She loved the house. She loved the house. She loved the house. He loved the idea of family harmony more than its messy realities. When I was 22, I walked into the Harrington boardroom, carrying the future on a laptop and a clean slide deck. I had sketched a cloud-based middleware solution that would have modernized our product line well before anyone else perceived the gap. I had rehearsed the pitch until my voice felt like a metronome. The room smelled of mahogany polish and authority. They were men who had been married to the company for decades. They smiled politely as I plugged in and began. 10 minutes in, I watched my father check his watch. He raised a hand, stopped me mid-sentence, and smiled with a condescension that tasted like iron. "That's creative, Lena," he said, turning to the board with an apologetic shrug. "But it's not practical for our clients. They want stability, not experiments." I packed my slides and left with a tight stomach and a resolve that felt like a new bone settling into place. I packed more than a bag. I packed a decision. I left Boston with $5,000, a head full of code, and a stubborn belief that I could build the thing they refused to see. California ate the first years. I lived in a studio that doubled as the desk where I debugged until my eyes stung. I freelanced, taught myself to sell, and funneled every spare dollar into the startup that would become Summit Ridge. I called the company Summit Ridge because it sounded like a place with altitude and promise, and because I wanted the name on the letterhead to mean something before I told anyone it was mine. For a decade I was the ghost in the system. I kept my real surname out of company filings. I was deliberate about invisibility. It was easier to be underestimated when no one could tie me to what I built. Years passed. I hired carefully. I traded long nights for equity, and lived on noodles if it meant the product kept shipping. I refined the middleware I had sketched at 22 into a robust integration platform that bridged legacy systems and cloud architecture cleanly and cheaply. We grew. We bought up small companies, not for the trophies, but to stitch their strengths into our platform. We raised capital without letting investors own the narrative. Summit Ridge became a name in the tech press, but it wore a hood. I had a public face when it was necessary, a fabricated persona who gave interviews and smiled politely. Most of the time Summit Ridge simply did the work and let its contracts speak louder than its PR. 10 years after the humiliating boardroom, I booked a private jet and told exactly one person about it. My friend Maya, who had shared the thin walls of our early apartments, asked if I was sure about returning for Thanksgiving. "They'll show off like it's a trophy show," she warned. I wanted to be there the moment my father realized the consequences of writing me off. I wanted the look on his face when he learned the person making the offer he'd been whispering about was his invisible daughter. I wore quiet signs of success, not the loud glitter of someone trying to flaunt a new life, but the small signals that mattered in our world. A watch that fit like a contained secret, a handbag that said I was deliberate, a pair of heels that made my stride a punctuation. I did not want to be charitable about it. I wanted them to see that everything they assumed about me was wrong. I wanted most of all to be seen for the work I had done. They greeted me with the practiced warmth of people who keep their emotions on a schedule. Mother hugged me like she was closing a book she had never quite finished reading. Ethan was already comfortably at the scotch, swaggering with old certainty. Chloe filmed her entrance in 30-degree lighting, checking angles and facial expressions for her audience. Father was in his study with papers spread like a map of his importance. I knocked and walked into a room that smelled like paper and power. "Lena," he said, the word measured and old as the house. He rose for a formal hug and sat back quickly. His gaze flicked to my sleeve, to the line of my suit, as if trying to decode the cost of what I wore. When his phone rang, he excused himself and turned away. I let my eyes travel across the desk and found, tucked under a spread of quarterly reports, a folder with a logo I knew well. Summit Ridge. I breathed. The world narrowed to the small flap of paper, and the tremor in the air that said plans were closing. Dinner that night was not conversation so much as a ritual. The dining table gleamed, the silver caught candlelight like measuring spoons for pride. I was seated far from the head, as I always had been, at a place that marked the distance between recognition and neglect. Ethan announced the usual, grateful for another record quarter. Grateful for his yacht, grateful for the soft attention of his world. Chloe thanked her followers like a modern psalm. Mother made small gestures toward peace, and Father checked his phone as if it were the only audience he needed. Then he stood. The knife against crystal made a precise ping, and the room leaned in. "I have an announcement," he began with the ceremonial weight he reserved for his reveals. He announced a sale, as if handing down a family heirloom. He had a buyer, he said, and he had chosen what he called the best path forward. He paused like a conductor savoring the silence. "The proceeds will not be an inheritance," he said. "They will fund the Harrington Foundation and secure our legacy." The table erupted. Ethan slammed a fist, as if the table itself were a betrayal. Chloe burst into a dramatic protest with perfect lighting. It was when my father named his buyer that the room tightened like a fist. He said the name with the self-satisfied cadence of a man who assumed strangers would be strangers. "Summit Ridge," he said. "They made a generous offer." I set my fork down with the exactness of something finally aligning. I had let the silence build as a kind of pressure. I watched his bravado start to crack. "Who is that?" I said, looking directly at him. "Who runs Summit Ridge?" Blank faces, a moment of confusion. Then the impossible seemed to slow around us. "I am Summit Ridge," I said. The room stopped in that middle place between breath and memory. Their breath hung in the chandelier's light. My father's face went through that quick movie of disbelief, fury, and then a kind of raw panic that makes people who think they own the world look like novices who had misplaced their map. Ethan knocked over his wine like a knife across the tablecloth. Chloe kept filming as if the chaos would translate into clicks. My mother reached for more wine like a salve for the sudden cold. I slid a card across the table. The brushed metal reflected the chandelier's light in a way that felt like proof. "Summit Ridge, Lena Blackwell, founder." The words were simple, elegantly honest, and they landed on the table like an unavoidable fact. "What is this?" Ethan demanded, rising like someone whose entire identity had been a comfortable chair. "You planned this to humiliate us." "No," I said. I planned this because 10 years ago you stood in that exact same room, and my plan was dismissed with a smile. I planned this because I wanted you to see what I had done without your help. They called it market manipulation, corporate conspiracy, greedy calculation. I called it strategy, patience, and the kind of market research that did not depend on secrets but on observation, on following publicly available statements and filings, on quietly purchasing stakes in supplier companies and clients until the network of relationships funneled into a real legal purchase. I had offered help months ago through a third party and been rebuffed. Pride, I realized, had been a greater enemy to the company than any competitor. When the shock receded into a low hum, my father rose like someone who'd been unmasked and stomped out. He slammed the study door behind him and called his lawyers as if the act of summoning legal muscle could reboot a narrative that had already been written in contracts and signatures. My mother followed, then Ethan, then Chloe, theatrically flustering her followers with her live stream. I sat alone at a table scattered with half-eaten pie and burned candles and watched the house I grew up in rewired around a truth they could not process. It should have felt like victory. It felt hollow in that particular way. Success does when it meets the people you most wanted to understand it. Later that night, Ethan found me in the room where my college trophies collected dust and where my code-scarred notebooks still sit by the desk. He walked in like a storm, tie undone, face raw. "We need to talk," he said, pushing past manners. He accused, he raged, he called me fake and conniving. I listened and then spoke the parts I needed him to hear. I told him how I had pitched the first middleware solution years ago and been dismissed. I told him how being underestimated had been a kind of fuel. When I mentioned numbers, he grew pale. I told him about missing transactions, about phantom vendor accounts, about money that had found a private path out of the company. He swore, he threatened, and finally he stormed out. I had his attention now, but the problem went deeper than family drama. It was an ethics problem, dressed as inheritance. Late that night, my mother sat with me on the edge of the bed. She had softened as the alcohol burned down. "You built something enormous, Lena," she said quietly. "Why didn't you tell me?" Her words were the confession of someone recognizing they had been complicit in the erasure of a child's efforts by refusing to ask. "I thought I was protecting you," she admitted. "I thought by keeping things calm I was doing right." Tears had leveled decades of silence into a small river between us. I told her I had wanted to be judged for results, not charity. She touched my hand and left me with a small truth. She had noticed my hunger, but she had not the tools to push back against a man like my father. I did not come home to win a war. I came home to draw a line where my life and their assumptions overlapped and to replace a family narrative that had prioritized image over people. The next morning, the press release would go out. Lawyers would read, agents would call, and the house would become a newsroom until the story spread. The kitchen felt oddly quiet as I moved through it at dawn, a cup of coffee steaming in my hand. I watched the sun find the garden like a hesitant witness. I was ready for the meeting with my father. I knew what I had done, but I also knew what I had to do next. As I walked to his study, I could still hear the echo of the night before. The clink of crystal, the scrape of chairs, the sound of a family as a business that suddenly had a new owner. I tested the metal of the business card in my pocket like a talisman and pushed the study door open. He sat behind his desk like a monarch in exile, older, smaller, baffled. He asked the question he had never asked before. "Shh. How did you do it?" I told him. I told him about nights with stale coffee, clients won by merit not name, and the particular virtue of being invisible. His face moved through something like regret, and then something like curiosity. "I thought I was protecting you," he said at last. I told him protection that smothers is not care. There was still so much to fight for. The company, the contracts, the relationships. The bones of the Harringtons' pride were brittle but thick. I did not come to destroy my family. I came to claim my place, and to build a version of the Harrington legacy that could survive the future. When I left the study, he extended an offer that surprised me. He offered to be a symbolic chairman with an office and respect, but no operational control. It was a fig leaf of dignity. I took it because I wanted him present, not triumphant. He took my hand across the desk, as if the touch could register an unspoken truce. In that grasp, there was the first honest professional agreement we'd ever made. But the dinner had not closed the book. At the edge of triumph lurked the deeper mess that had always made our family unhealthy. I had to choose how to navigate it. I intended to be firm, but not vengeful. I wanted to clean house, but not to humiliate. The next hours would test everything I had become. The press release went out 8 minutes early because news cycles have their own hunger. An assistant called to say the feeds were live, and my phone exploded with messages. Outside the house, a van of local reporters idled like predators. Inside, someone whispered the word embezzlement, the real dagger that would either break my brother or force the family into a rare honesty. The storm was palpable. I closed my eyes and listened for a small voice inside me that had never let public opinion steer my decisions. I was prepared to pay the price for truth. The final sentence my father spoke before storms and lawyers and cameras arrived was simple and indifferent at first. "You are my daughter, or you are the person who took my company." I thought of two paths, both sharp and necessary. I looked at him and said, quietly, "I am both." The house felt like a held breath. Outside, the world waited for the next move. Inside, the family had been rearranged in a single declarative moment. I had opened a door that could not be closed. I had to decide how far I was willing to go to make sure the company survived and the family learned how to see one another. And then Ethan walked back into the room, with a look in his eye I had seen before in Games and Debts. He slammed a fist on the desk and almost smiled, like someone entering a final round. He promised me it was not over. I placed my hand on the contract folder and felt the weight of signatures and the cool finality of legal paper. I had built the offer, but now I had to build the bridge back, if it was possible. I had to decide whether to cross, or to watch them fall. Outside, the white sky over the hedges felt like a question. Inside, the kitchen clock ticked like a metronome. I turned the page, because the story was not finished, and the next morning, when the world tuned in, an old secret would be exposed that would not only change the company's balance sheet, but the family ledger in ways none of us had expected. The morning light had a sterile quality, as if the day itself wanted to keep things neutral. I made coffee on autopilot and checked the company feeds. Summit Ridge's press contact confirmed everything would go live at 9. My inbox was a hive of congratulatory notes, shocked queries, and cautious outreach from clients who suddenly wondered where their contracts would fall. I had rehearsed the message with my counsel. We had contingency plans for every likely maneuver. I felt prepared and oddly hollow, like a runner who had trained for a race that no longer felt like victory, if it crossed another human's dignity. My father stood by the window in his study when I walked in. He looked smaller in the daylight. The house had always made him look like it owned him, but now the man seemed diminished in the frame of his own possessions. He told me lawyers confirmed the sale was binding. He asked me the practical questions he had never asked in youth. What will happen to the staff, to our clients, to the brand that bore the family name? I answered with the clarity of someone who had built a business, not been born into papers. Harrington Systems would become Harrington by Summit Ridge for a time. Then we would gradually fold the best of both companies into a restructured unit with updated technology and fewer politics. I promised protection where it was strategic, restructuring where it was necessary. He listened. Sometimes he flinched. At other times he asked a question that had the scent of real curiosity. It was a tiny, dangerous thing, the possibility that his pride could bend towards something like respect. He asked, quietly, how I had constructed the deal, how I had orchestrated the acquisitions of suppliers and the courting of clients. The answer seemed to matter to him in a way he could not have imagined years ago. I did it by being patient, I said. By buying small stakes during windowed dips, by offering value to companies that needed an exit from complacency. He listened like a man learning new parts of a language he used to speak. That afternoon the family fractured in predictable and messy ways. Ethan raged at the sense of entitlement he thought the world owed him. He called lawyers and men with names that sounded like they had been dialed 1,000 times. Chloe filmed herself in the foyer, tears and hashtags performing a narrative of betrayal that insulated her from the more complicated truth. She had built a career on our surname and the illusion that the world owed her context beyond the sales. The staff watched with the mixture of loyalty and fear that always follows a shift in ownership. Some hugged me in the hall and whispered saints and prayers. Others kept distant faces and folded hands. It was Maria, our housekeeper of 20 years, who gave me a tiny private blessing. She pressed a small envelope into my palm with a folded smile, and the long memory of someone who'd watched a family stride through decades of gain and quiet loss. "You always had the mind, Miss Lena," she said simply, and then retreated into the kitchen where the radio murmured old songs. Her words landed like a benediction I had missed. When the press release hit, the reaction unfurled in predictable media patterns. Headlines that had once quoted my father, now quoted me. Columnists marveled at the audacity of the takeover. Social feeds exploded into think pieces about family businesses and the dangers of pride. I read it all with a detached attention that surprised me. Part of me loved seeing the work recognized. Another part watched the ripple effects on the family like a scientist watching an experiment tip. Ethan called me that night, hammering accusations. "You used our name to humiliate us," he said. I told him that name was precisely why I had offered an anonymous help package months earlier, and was refused. "You did it for revenge," he insisted. "You picked Thanksgiving to hurt us." "I picked Thanksgiving because I remember a Thanksgiving where you were elevated and I was erased," I said. Those were honest words that landed like small splinters. Days later, the board of Harrington Systems called an emergency meeting. They demanded documents, signatures, and explanations. We arranged a transitional committee that included a neutral advisory board of industry veterans. I insisted on transparency. If this was to work, it had to be legitimate and orderly, not spectacle and salvage. My goal was not to erase my family's entire identity, but to redesign it so the company could survive and prosper. Underneath corporate repositioning, a darker current surged. I had found anomalies in the ledgers when I began the due diligence. Minor amounts here, phantom invoices there. When my analysts traced the transaction paths, a trail emerged like footprints in a carefully swept floor. It led to an office keycard, to IP logs, to dates when only one person had been present in the system. Ethan's office. He was skilled at looking casual, but sloppy in record-keeping once he thought the books were too dull to look at daily. Confronting that truth would shatter more than a shareholder's spreadsheet. I knew it, but if Harrington Systems was to be healthy, toxic rot had to be exposed. I printed a stack of transaction records and set them on my father's desk with the gentle cruelty of someone asking the family for honesty. He did not scream at first. He let the paper sit between us like a divided river. Then his hands trembled as he sifted through numbers that told a different story than the one he had told himself. "How much?" he asked. Voice smaller than the room, I named a number that made a new kind of sound in the space. Siphoned funds, false vendors, payments routed through consulting accounts, $300,000. A number that could be called both petty and corrosive. It was an amount that did not destroy the company in a ledger sense, but destroyed trust in an intimate one. He turned to me with something like a child's hope. He would never, he said. Ethan would never. He wanted to believe the son he had raised to prefer living to working was not capable of theft. It was a father speaking by habit and love more than fact. I showed him logs, matched timestamps with card swipes, and watched his face change from denial to stunned clarity. The house felt colder than it had the night of the dinner. We did not call the police immediately. I had spent years learning that families can fracture under the blunt instrument of public accusations. I wanted to offer a path that could protect the company from collapse and give Ethan a chance to rectify his mistakes without destroying his life. I offered the family a choice: resign, repay, or face legal consequences in a way that would be handled with dignity but also accountability. I had no taste for theatrics, but I did want the truth. Ethan reacted like a wounded animal. He raged, then pleaded. Then tried to bargain with a mixture of bravado and fear. He promised to pay back whatever he took if allowed to stay under strict probation. I told him that trust was not an account you could restore with cash alone. I told him that the company could not have executives who treated its treasury like a personal ATM. In the end, he chose scorched earth and exile, accepting a conditional severance if he repaid and allowed oversight. He left with a loud slam and a promise to fight, which I took as a promise to change. Chloe surprised me. She had filmed that early moment of chaos and later approached me with an odd earnestness. She proposed a deal. She would use her platform to humanize the company, to show our clients and consumers a different story. In exchange, she wanted a seat at a very different table, brand partnerships, product ambassadorships, and a real education in the business part of the company. Her offer was transactional but sincere. She wanted to be part of something she had always showcased without understanding the mechanics under the surface. I decided to give her a small role, not out of mercy, but because she had a skill set we lacked in-house. She would be tested, trained, and expected to learn. If she failed, the role would be revoked. Mother, who had once been the house's soft voice, surprised me most of all. She stepped away from the wine glass and into something like accountability. She began volunteering in education programs, reduced her drinking, and quietly joined the board of a tech incubator. Her life gained a new rhythm, and she offered to help mentor other women who had been left out by their own families. I watched her reclaim pieces of herself that had been shelved in service of peace. It was small and brave, and quietly revolutionary, for someone of her generation. The transition period was brutal. There were days when old resentments rose like tidewater and threatened to drown the steady work of integration. There were staff who left, fearing instability. There were clients who demanded reassurances in the form of contracts and guarantees. I worked 12-hour days and slept in a guest room when the jet lag from cross-country travel found me. The legal paperwork was endless. The human work was harder. It demanded empathy and the will to sit with people who had been hurt by this change. One evening, months into the transition, I found myself in the renovated lab space we had created in the old Harrington building. We had gutted offices and replaced cold cubicles with open desks, whiteboards, and plants like small moral gestures. The integration team had gathered enough of the old product code and the new API bridges into a working demo. We had started to move clients to secure cloud environments, and the metrics were quiet music: decreased latency, increased uptime, happier customers. The staff who remained were veteran engineers and new hires who had been recruited for grit rather than pedigree. They cheered when tests passed like a sports team that had learned to win without showboating. Later, in the conference room, my father stopped by and stayed longer than usual. He told me about Arthur, my grandfather, about how he used to solder chips in a garage and laugh at deadlines. He confessed he remembered my first pitch oddly fondly, and that perhaps he had been too focused on preserving a legacy to notice its erosion. "You forced me to look," he said. I was proud of what I built, but blind to the ways it had frayed. The admission landed on me like a warm, strange rain. It was not absolution. It was an opening. Yet even as we found footholds, outside forces tested the fragile new order. A rival firm tried to capitalize on Harrington Systems' turbulence. Media commentators questioned whether a daughter buying her father's company was ethically sound even when everything had been legal and above board. Some colleagues whispered about cold vengeance and family drama. But the most important reaction was quieter. Clients who had left a year earlier were returning with new contracts. A few long-standing clients admitted they had been tempted to move on because the old tech had begun to fail. Our integration platform had kept promises in ways Harrington's legacy code could not. That was the vindication that mattered. Then on a damp spring afternoon, Chloe sat with me in a small studio the company had rented for product marketing. She handed me her phone and showed me a sequence of videos she had put together, raw, honest pieces that told our story from her angle. She had reframed the saga into a narrative of growth and reconciliation, and it worked. The public saw us in a different light, and the numbers reflected it. The company stabilized and slowly moved from survival mode to growth mode. I traveled between Boston and San Francisco, splitting time between Summit Ridge's headquarters and the newly reimagined Harrington campus. I'd brought in an executive team that balanced outsiders with institutional knowledge, and we had a weekly ritual where my father could speak about history and I could outline strategy. He slipped sometimes into old behaviors, and I bristled, but then I would remember the man who had shown cracks of humility and breathe. On a cool evening months after I first announced the acquisition, I stood in the lobby of the newly integrated building and looked at a timeline mural that traced our 3 generations: grandfather's garage, father's expansion, and then my own footprint. My picture had been placed beside theirs, modest, but visible. It was a small victory. It felt like someone finally adjusted the magnifying glass and noticed the middle child had been working all along. But there was one thing I had not expected. Success does not erase past emptiness. It does not automatically knit up relationships. Progress requires repair work and patience. I had thought the company would be the primary battleground, but the family ledger demanded attention too. There would be dinners where old habits reasserted themselves, arguments over memory and credit, and nights when my father would drift back into old stories that excluded me. The fragile thing I had built could be undone by complacency, and that meant I had to be unrelenting about both the product roadmap and the family therapy of our household. I wanted to lead with strength and softness simultaneously, but that is an awkward balance. I had to teach people who had always had authority to accept guidance from someone who used to be invisible. It was both an ethical and a practical lesson. I would have to coax trust out of pride, show grace to people who had snubbed me, and expect accountability where behavior had been dangerous. It was exhausting and necessary work. People asked if this was revenge. I answer with 2 truths. First, vindication is a cold reward when it replaces human connection. Second, if reclaiming my life required the strategic patience to build a company that preserved jobs and modernized infrastructure, then I would carry that label if others need it as a shorthand. I built something practical, adaptive, and humane. I refused to make the story one of tit for tat. I wanted to build a future we could all inhabit without shame. The hardest tests were personal. There was a night, 3 months into the new regime, when my father and I sat late in the office and the city lights blinked like quiet witnesses outside the window. He looked at me and said, "You accomplished more than I thought possible." I was wrong about a lot of things. It was a small phrase. It changed me. It did not erase the past, but it gave us a way forward. I kept a careful watch on Ethan. He left for a university program that was more a quiet exile than reinvention at first. He called sometimes, awkwardly, with questions about cash flow and customer churn that made me smile and watch for sincerity. Chloe settled into her role and thrived in ways none of us predicted. Mother volunteered and found a new kind of purpose. The family did not transform overnight. It moved like a glacier. Slowly, inexorably, and with friction, We had weathered the first storms. I had won the legal and strategic battles. The company was healthy, and family wounds were open, but healing had begun. For anyone watching a similar story unfold in their own life, I would say this success is a tool, not a trophy. Use it to fix the structures that leave people behind. Use it to call out wrongdoing without cruelty. Use it to craft the possibility of repair. And yet, even in the midst of stability, a hidden truth remained. The ledger had been balanced in the visible sense, but there were still ghosts in the system. Small signs of sabotage against new processes appeared in code logs, subtle attempts to reroute clients, and one senior manager who resigned with an odd amount of calm. The world of corporate reinvention is never purely rational. It is full of messy human choices. I watched those anomalies, like a doctor watching an unexplained symptom. I suspected not all the threats had exhausted themselves. One evening, when I least expected it, a package arrived at my desk at Summit Ridge. There was no return address. Inside was a single flash drive and a handwritten note with 4 words. Not finished yet. I held the drive in my hand like a warning. A cold line of understanding traced my spine. Whatever I had undone, there were people invested in keeping things crooked. I was not just running a company. I had stepped into a defensive position in an old war. I called my head of security and my counsel. We would trace the drive and check logs. I slept badly that night, like someone preparing for battle after a ceasefire had already been breached. The company was stable, but stability is a fragile candle in a room full of drafts. I realized then how little I had imagined success would require the stamina of a long guard. I had won the boardroom. I had exposed theft. I had created a pathway for reconciliation. But I had also opened a door to vigilance. The flash drive was a reminder that moments of triumph often invite the attention of those who profit from disorder. The next morning the logs revealed nothing obvious at first, but then a pattern emerged. Small erroneous API calls targeted at our most sensitive clients. Someone was poking at the seams. I convened the team. We set traps and audits, and I learned to sleep with a phone beside me again. There would be no dramatic meltdown this time, but a slow war of attrition, obfuscated code, shadow accounts, and attempts to shore up old alliances. This was life after victory. It was noisy and mundane, and every bit as dangerous as the dramatic headlines that had announced our takeover. I realized that winning was not a single moment, but a daily choice. The narrative I wanted, a company that respected its people and built products that mattered, required guardianship, not vengeance. I steeled myself. I was prepared to defend what I had created and to continue rebuilding what family had once failed to protect. And yet, in the middle of plotting screens and boardrooms, there were small, quiet human moments that made it all worth the watch. One afternoon, a junior developer, a woman who had once coded in a coffee shop with dreams much like mine, came up to me with an idea. She trembled and then explained how a tiny shift could reduce client onboarding time by 30%. I sat with her, sketched out an approach on a napkin, and felt the same spark that had kept me alive in a studio apartment years ago. This was the new Harrington, messy, imperfect, and alive. I would always carry the scar of being unseen. But I had also collected tools, strategy, and a stubborn heart. I had made choices that reclaimed the narrative for myself, and perhaps, for the people I'd love enough to keep in my life. The war was not over. It rarely is. But we were no longer fumbling in the dark. We had lighted rooms, legal counsel, systems that actually worked, and people who had learned that the company could be more than a legacy of ego. Then one morning, a message arrived from an unexpected sender. It had no subject, just an unadorned sentence. "There's one more file you haven't seen." My hands tightened. The past had not finished with me. Someone else had been watching every move I'd made during the acquisition. Someone else had been patient enough to wait until the family tumbled apart and then pick through the pieces. I stared at the words and felt the old familiar drumbeat of a new threat. It was not the first time I had been tested, and it would not be the last, but I knew the stakes were higher now. It was no longer simply about the company. It was about the integrity of the system I had chosen to build. I summoned my legal team, my technical leads, and my security chief, and told them to prepare for what might be the most delicate fight of our new life. The quiet victory had become the overture for a more complicated movement. Someone was still pulling threads. I would find them. I would make sure the company's future belonged to the work and not to the manipulations of those who refused to change. And then the message blinked again. A second line appeared. You didn't catch everything in the audit. The words were small, but they contained a big accusation and a challenge I could not ignore. The words sat in my inbox like a live coal. You didn't catch everything in the audit. The sender anonymous, the tone deliberate. I felt for a second the pounding anxiety of the old days. The nights in the studio apartment, scrounging for every call and every lead. Only this time I had teams, lawyers, and systems. Only this time the enemy was not nameless incompetence, but a calculated actor who seemed to enjoy the unfinished business of the Harrington house. We dug. The security team methodically traced APIs, cross-referenced IP addresses, and traced access logs like investigators piecing together a crime. The flash drive proved to be a red herring in one sense. It held nothing too revealing, but its appearance had been a catalyst. In the codebase we found something that should not have been, a tiny shell script hidden in a legacy module, scheduled to trigger under a set of conditions so specific it almost felt like a personal signature. It had been dormant, clever in its concealment, waiting for the right state to execute. We traced its origin through commits and timestamps. It led to a user account that on paper had been created for an outside vendor, but the digital fingerprints pointed in one direction, a machine in the old Harrington network, assigned to an executive office with a view of the garden. The evidence stacked like a grim ladder. The pattern of suspicious vendor payments mapped to the same windows when phantom invoices had been created. The IP logs, the server access, the sticky trail through timestamps, it all led to a person who had thrived on being charismatic and invisible in equal measure. Ethan. I had suspected it before, but now the data arrived like a convicted witness. Confrontation felt like a surgical strike that had to be precise and merciful enough to allow for either change or accountability. I called Ethan in and laid out the proof with the clinical calm of someone presenting a case. He lashed out with a string of rage and humiliation, calling me a usurper and a villain. He said he had only borrowed small sums for things that counted as living and luck, not theft. I showed him bank trails and vendor entries. He called his denials into a faster heartbeat, then said something that cut deeper. You could have asked me first. You could have asked me to stay, I replied. You could have taken a different path than thinking everything owed to you. My words did not console him. He stormed out like a man who had been disintegrated. His exit left a wind in the room like someone who had slammed a door on the rest of us. We settled on an arrangement that was equal parts consequence and mercy. He resigned and agreed to repay the funds and enroll in a program geared toward financial ethics and management. We kept the legal option open but aimed for a resolution that would not drag the company into a spectacle. He took his severance and left with a suitcase of that bitter kind of dignity that pretends it was all part of a plan. I watched him go and felt a complicated sorrow. I had not wanted to destroy him, but I could not allow theft to be part of the company's operating rhythm. Then the anonymous messages stopped, replaced by a quieter, more dangerous campaign. Someone began introducing subtle chaos, a delay in key client reports, a misrouted invoice that almost triggered a licensing violation, a modified contractor agreement. These were not violent attempts to take the company down, but precise efforts to erode trust. Whoever was working against us understood how to make a company look incompetent without itself appearing. That was a sophisticated, cowardly sabotage. I convened a team of forensic IT specialists and outside auditors. We instituted stricter access protocols, rotated keys, and closed old admin accounts. Every week we would run an audit and present the findings to the board. We tightened the loan processes and required multi-party sign-offs for large transfers. The company's heart slowed to a monitored rhythm as we patched and updated, but the psychological damage remained. Some staff left, others stayed and worked with a newfound vigilance. The environment grew quieter, like a home where everyone had learned to keep their doors locked. Meanwhile, someone in the old guard tried a different tack. A senior manager with years under his belt resigned, citing family reasons, and within weeks surfaced at a small competitor. The timing resembled an old bleed, people leaving at the wrong moment, projects delayed, client meetings postponed. I watched patterns with a jaundiced eye and realized that transitions can feel like a vacuum to opportunists. People who had relied on the chaos of the old system found the new rules uncomfortable. They left on principle or were quietly nudged out when their values misaligned with the company's new ethos. There were small human victories too. Chloe, who had once been the family's curated image, began to show up in meetings informed and prepared. She asked questions that indicated real comprehension. She began working with product teams to design campaigns grounded in usefulness rather than merely glamour. She learned to draft a budget and read a cash flow projection, and I watched the light of competence unlock inside her. Her transformation was not dramatic or instant. It was incremental and real. She became part of the solution rather than part of the problem. Months wore on. The metrics improved. Customer renewals ticked upwards. New contracts rolled in. It felt like climbing a slope with occasional doubts, but mostly steady progress. We had earned back trust through product reliability and communication. The brand shifted away from the old family story to something a modern market could trust. I found myself in the strange position of standing in the middle of a business I loved and being responsible for people who were once indifferent to my presence. I felt protective in a way I had not expected. Then a box arrived at my desk in a nondescript courier bag. Inside a stack of printed emails and a single photograph. The picture was of a mid-level procurement officer from Harrington Systems, hands on a keyboard, a particular vendor portal open. Taped to the image was a note, "Not everything is what it seems." The irony was a hot metallic penny we could not ignore. Someone wanted us to know that corruption was not neatly sorted by bloodlines. They wanted us to know the map was more complicated. We investigated the procurement officer's accounts and found a small network of shell vendors that had been used to divert funds in minor increments. The corruption had been less about one greedy actor and more about an ecosystem of practices that tolerated sloppiness until it became theft. The system had to be rebuilt from the ground up. We implemented new vendor vetting, continuous transaction monitoring, and a mandate that any vendor over a threshold amount had to be reviewed by 2 independent teams. In the middle of this, my father called me in his quietest voice. He had found a box in his study, old ledgers from Arthur's early years, and he had opened it. There were notes, letters, and a tattered ledger that showed Arthur's humility and his love for the craft. He had loved the work more than the show. He apologized for not seeing me, not asking, not listening. His admission was small and late, but it was a start. We met in the eyes of 2 people who had been shipwrecked by different tides but still had a common anchor. The family dinners grew smaller and more honest. We picked up our conversations at a different level. There were still barbs, still glances that cut like old habits, but occasionally someone would ask a question aimed at understanding rather than domination. Those nights tasted like an early form of reconciliation. Talent and humility met in awkward shapes across the table. It was fragile, but it was real. The longer I ran the company, the more I learned the necessary truth of leadership the center holds when it is built on competence, integrity, and the willingness to make people accountable without crushing them. I believed in consequence, not cruelty. I also believed in mentoring those willing to change. That conviction would be tested when a new challenge arrived from an unanticipated angle, the company's own past clients. A major client, a manufacturing firm that had been with Harrington for years, threatened to pull their contract after a data discrepancy in an integration report. It was a precarious moment where a small technical error could become a major brand crisis. My team worked through the night, tracing logs and rebuilding the integration. We presented a transparent report and offered a remediation plan. The client stayed. The triumph was quiet but essential. We learned that transparency, admitting problems, showing plans, and fixing them, paid dividends in long-term trust. Through it all, I kept an eye on the anonymous messages. They were intermittent, but always pointed to a new vulnerability. Whoever sent them seemed to want two things: to unsettle us, and to ensure we did not grow complacent. They had a rule of engagement that felt personal. We attempted to turn the dynamic to advantage by setting honeypots, fake vulnerabilities, to bait further action. The attackers took a few jabs that revealed patterns. They seemed to be someone with old system knowledge and an understanding of internal processes. They had been waiting for the moment someone would try to clean house. Months later, our trap worked. A login attempt came from an old admin account that should have been retired. But we had kept it active, silently, as a trace station. The attempt came from a user who used a VPN to mask his origin. The pattern of access pointed to a nearby regional internet node. We cross-checked the times with building access logs and found a match. The badge swipes indicated someone had been physically on the premises while attempting to access the systems remotely. We had the data we needed. We had found the saboteur. The culprit was not who I expected. He was a contracted developer who had been let go during the first months of restructuring. A programmer who felt his dismissal had been unfair and had the technical chops and personal grievance to attempt sabotage. He had connections with ex-employees who had helped obfuscate his movements. He admitted that his intent had been to hurt the company by creating distrust. His confession came with a hollow apology and a negotiation for leniency that would include cooperation to restore systems and a restitution plan. I sat across from him with my lawyer and security chief present. He explained his anger, his sense of betrayal, and his intent. He tried to make the case for moral justification. I had no taste for his martyrdom. He had chosen to escalate his hurt into criminal behavior. There was a cost for that. We struck a deal: he would assist in repairing the damage and provide evidence of anyone who had aided him, in exchange for a reduced sentence and a structured restitution plan. Justice, in this case, included a practical route toward repairing what he had broken. That resolution felt like a moral compromise, imperfect and imperfectly satisfying. But it reinstated systems and allowed us to move forward without endless litigation. The message to staff was clear: wrongdoing would be addressed, but we preferred remediation and accountability over spectacle. The company stabilized again, and trust, like a muscle, began to rebuild with careful exercise. Through the chaos I learned the beauty of quiet things: a junior developer's success, my father's small apologies, my sister's newfound competence. The company became less a family trophy and more a living organism. I had done what I had set out to do: protect the work and the people who did it. And then one late night, as the office hummed with the glow of monitors, a new arrival arrived at my desk. A thin envelope containing a single photograph of a man I'd never considered an enemy. He wore a familiar smile, and the note on the back read, "You thought you were done." The implication was clear. Even when we fixed what was broken, not all actors would accept the repair. Some benefited from instability and would continue to sow it. I realized then that the work I'd started was not a project with an end date, it was stewardship. It was the daily diligence of protecting a shared resource from those who would exploit it. It required patience, resilience, and occasionally, the willingness to show mercy without relinquishing accountability. I set the photograph face up on my desk and watched it as if it were a warning. We had stabilized the company and begun to mend the family. We had exposed the hidden ledger and built systems to prevent its revival. But someone still wanted to unsettle us, and the truth was that institutions that change always invite those with a vested interest in disorder. I would not pretend it was comfortable. I would, however, meet it with the same steady resolve that had powered my early years in a cramped apartment, because building, protecting, and improving what others had handed down, imperfectly, was the work I had chosen. Soon, a new program launched to integrate ethics training for managers and a vendor oversight portal that made ghost vendors harder to hide. We designed a communications plan to be transparent with clients and the public. We made decisions that prioritized longevity over optics. The company would survive, and perhaps thrive, because we had rebuilt the scaffolding stronger than before. Still, the photograph on my desk remained. It felt like the dark tale of a story not fully ended. The note had promised more. I braced myself for the next chapter. Someone had a grudge, and the patience to see it play out. I would not be surprised at what came next, only watchful. And then my assistant walked in with a single phrase that made the world tilt. "Lena, you have to see this." She placed a tablet on my desk and with hands that were steadier than her voice, opened a feed that showed a live stream with my sister in the center. Chloe was on camera, and her followers were watching as she opened a document, a sealed letter from our father, intended to be read after he passed. The whole family watched in the stream, but the video also revealed something else. A ledger entry that mentioned a name we had not expected, a name that had been removed from corporate memory years ago. A new secret had been nudged into daylight, and it suggested a lineage of decisions older and more complicated than we had thought. The past had more relatives in the present than we had assumed. I took a breath. I had thought the hardest fights were behind me. I was wrong. The Donovan file, a name that appeared in those old ledgers, suggested there were historical agreements and complicated relationships with people outside the family that could still affect us today. I felt a familiar muscle tighten. We had cleaned the obvious corruption, but the past had other shadows to expose. The ledger kept whispering. I would follow its lines until they led me to the truth. The Donovan entry was small and old, a notation in an ink that had faded, but refused to vanish. The name belonged to a vendor that had been quietly important in the company's early years. I assigned an investigative team to trace the history. We held interviews with long-retired staff, and checked archived contracts. The trail led to an old agreement Arthur had made with a small logistics firm in the 80s. An arrangement that once made sense in a world of paper and handshake contracts, but had become a structural weakness in the era of digital legibility. Sometimes crime is not a single act of malice, but a compromise accumulated over decades. Arthur had chosen survival by alliance in a different time, and that narrative had lodged like a splinter in the corporate tissue. The Donovan connection revealed a web of obligations and gratitude that had been convenient then but toxic now. It explained why certain vendors had always been shielded, why certain contracts had remained unreviewed. It explained how the old culture normalized blind spots. We redesigned procurement systems with the Donovan lesson in mind. We audited every old agreement and created a sunset clause for archaic contracts that had outlived their usefulness. We tied vendor relationships to performance metrics and independent oversight. The work was tedious and necessary. I had learned to love the tedium of building durable systems. It was in the detail that change rooted. Our attempts at structural repair began to move the company toward a healthier state, but rewards were not all professional. There were human moments that surprised me with warmth. My father started mentoring young hires, not with the performative hand of a man who wanted praise, but with the practical patience of someone rediscovering what it meant to teach. He stopped telling the company's origin story as a heroic solo act and started telling it as a story of collaboration and hard years. That small shift in language mattered. It helped people feel like they belonged to something shared rather than a shrine to one name. At home, things shifted too. Thanksgiving the following year was the smallest one we had held in decades. No full-table theater, no speeches about record quarters. We cooked together in the kitchen, real work, simmering and slicing and laughing about small things like overcooked pies and a lack of talk show style. There was much less performance and much more listening. It was imperfect. It was real. We were learning to be a family in ways neither of us had been trained to do. But the photograph on my desk, and the note that said "you thought you were done," returned like a slow tide. Our saboteur had been a symptom, not the disease. The disease had been systemic complacency, inherited blind spots, and the belief that loyalty to a name could trump ethics. I had fought for transparency and accountability, but the real work was cultural and generational, and culture changes slowly. We focused on stewardship. We started a foundation named not in the singular, but to reflect the future, the Harrington Collaborative for Digital Literacy. It freed the Harrington name from the idea that legacy was only ownership, and instead suggested it could be stewardship and access. We funded scholarships, incubated startups, led by women and marginalized businesses, and built programs that taught ethical financial practices for young managers. My mother volunteered, and her face lit up when she told me about young women who had found ways out of marriages that had kept them small. This felt more like repair than anything we'd done before. Professionally, Summit Ridge maintained momentum. We rolled out a second integration suite optimized for small to mid-sized manufacturers. It was more accessible, less boutique, and it fixed problems Harrington systems had been slow to address. The product found a market, and the revenue improved. The public narrative shifted from scandal to comeback. I watched clients return not because I demanded it, but because we had made ourselves worthy of trust. And yet there was always the human knot. Ethan returned one morning, older and quieter, and asked for help. He had been through a humiliating truth machine at the business school he had chosen, and realized shame is not a teacher. Accountability is. He apologized, awkwardly. He asked if I would help him find a way to rebuild. I gave him a path that required effort and humility, a repayment schedule, required coursework, and a probationary advisory role that would be contingent on real contribution. He worked slowly, and we watched a person emerge who could be something like a colleague rather than a competitor. Rebuilding trust takes longer than winning a contract. We both learned that in time. There were external tests too. Competitors tried to poach our engineers with extravagant salaries and slick promises. A journalist dug up a minor error we had made during the transition and tried to build a narrative of governance failure. We answered with honesty and actionable plans, and wide distribution of our remediation steps. Transparency worked again. The market rewarded accountability. The company matured. One evening, months into this new rhythm, an unknown caller left me a message. It was short. "You cleaned the house. Now look in the attic." The voice was not threatening so much as provocation. The attic metaphor felt apartment. My family had always stored the past in attics. Old ledgers, unopened letters, assumptions that wanted privacy. I felt the contours of a new investigation begin. We found an old trunk in a forgotten storage closet in the Harrington building, a box Arthur had kept. Inside were letters and contracts not digitized, and a set of encrypted microfilm plates that referenced a shell company used in the 80s for logistics and shipping. The more we pulled on those threads, the more it became clear that the Donovan affair had tentacles in other corners of the business world. The web included politicians, logistics firms, and partners whose names still carried weight in local business circles. I was not naive. I knew investigating those ties would make noise and attract attention from people with unresolved stakes. But the point of stewardship is not to protect only what you like. It is to make the hard, ugly work public, so the systems can be remedied. I brought in a skilled investigative counsel and a small team of forensic accountants. We traced old money and contracts and discovered that some obligations had been more about mutual protection agreements in an era when regulation was laxer. Those past compacts had been convenient for a different time, but they were now corrosive. Removing them required diplomacy, legal work, and at times, the courage to refuse polite arrangements that were ethically compromised. One senior partner refused to cooperate and pushed back loudly. He called the investigation a witch hunt and launched simultaneous legal threats. We braced. The press smelled drama. For a moment the company shuddered as a legal storm threatened to become a tempest. But the thoroughness of our audits and the transparency of our process undermined the accusations. We emerged legally intact, morally stronger, and with a clearer balance sheet. The partners' influence crumbled when optics and evidence converged against them. It was a painful public and necessary pruning. On the other side of the pruning, something unexpected happened. Former employees who had left with bitterness, people who thought they'd been shoved out, reached out and asked to return. Not all were rehired, but a few came back with an attitude of humility and renewed dedication. One young engineer, who had once been frustrated with the old hierarchy, returned with an idea that improved our deployment pipelines and reduced client downtime dramatically. Sometimes the best consequence of showing integrity is that it invites people to step back toward repair. Family dinner became less a pressure cooker and more a practice. We learned to ask questions that sought understanding rather than dominance. We grew impatient sometimes and slipped into old fights, but the pattern shifted. The work at the company helped because it demanded a level of merit and accountability that bled into our private lives. My father took to writing short notes to people who helped him. He taught me about negotiation without ego. It surprised both of us how useful those small habits were in easing tension. There remained the saboteur's last lingering echo, the anonymous alerts, the thin envelope, the man in the photograph. We traced his connections and found he had been a node in an old network that benefited from instability. When we removed the water that had allowed the mold to spread by reforming procurement and by training managers in ethical finance, the risk of small sabotage faded. People invested in the old disorder had to find new livelihoods or accept a different culture. Many left. Some adapted. A few held grudges that never softened. Such is the messy business of change. The year after the acquisition, we held a small, unannounced ceremony in the lobby of the newly renovated Harrington campus. We put up a plaque that told the company's true origin story: a garage, a stubborn founder, a century of incremental craft, and a turning point toward stewardship and inclusion. My photograph hung beside my grandfather's and my father's with no hierarchy. 3 faces in a line that said not that one was better, but that together they were part of a longer arc. People cheered modestly. Some staff brought their families. The plaque was small but heavy, and its weight felt like a promise. Around that time Mother told me she wanted to create a scholarship in my grandfather's name for girls going into computer science. She wanted them to have support and mentorship in an industry that often kept them out. I helped design the program. She hosted an inaugural dinner for the first scholars and stood beaming as they described their projects with a confidence that once would have made her nervous. It was a small victory, but one that felt uncommonly generous. Ethan called one day and asked if he could stop by. He had finished his coursework and wanted to discuss a potential role, helping with client relations, where his charm would not be a problem but his diligence would be tested. I told him I would give him a probationary task and see how he performed. He took it seriously. The grace of a second chance depends on honest work, not entitlement. He gave both. He still had long nights of atonement to work through, but he had begun. Chloe launched a campaign for our consumer-facing tools that combined functionality with aesthetics. She had learned the language of product managers and the patience required to iterate. I sat in on a launch and watched her speak about the tools with a clear understanding that made me proud. She had evolved without losing herself. She had stopped being a caricature and become a person willing to labor for something more than likes. Sometimes people asked if I had achieved revenge. I would answer with a sentence that had taken me years to shape: success alone is a poor substitute for reconciliation. The point was never to ruin those who had wronged me, but to build something that would be useful, ethical, and durable. If people were changed along the way, that was a welcome side effect. If not, then they would find their fate in their own hands. I felt no need to punish for my own satisfaction. The work itself felt like reparation. A few years in, an industry award recognized the Harrington Collaborative for Digital Literacy for outstanding contributions to regional education. I accepted the plaque at a small ceremony and thought of Arthur soldering circuits under a bare light bulb, and of the nights I had written code in the glow of a borrowed radiator. I reflected on how different kinds of legacy are made, not by monuments, but by opportunities extended, and by the tenacity to do the right thing when it is hard. Still, the past has a way of whispering. A final anonymous envelope arrived one winter evening. The handwriting was different, older. Inside was a simple line: "You did more than I expected." No signature. Hitch some more gears. Was a confirmation neither sought nor required. It was a small blessing from someone who had been watching from the periphery, perhaps an old rival, perhaps an enemy, perhaps a man learning the gravity of his choices. The note was ambiguous and kind in a way that ended the long row of threats with an odd grace. I taped that note in the back of a book on my shelf. It felt like a bookmark for a chapter that had closed. It did not mean everything was perfect. It meant that the longest part of the work, the daily repair, had begun to hold. Our systems were stronger. Our family was imperfectly stitched back together. Our company had found meaning and purpose beyond profit. One night, years later, sitting in my office with the city lights scattered like a constellation beneath me, my father called and said only, "I think your grandfather would have been proud." My eyes stung with something that was not precisely joy, but a kind of completion. It had taken me years to prove myself to anyone, and now a final kind of recognition had arrived, not because I had won a personal duel, but because the work had become larger than the family, and better for it. For anyone watching this who has been invisible or dismissed, who thinks the world does not make room for them, remember this: patient work, strategic thinking, and an ethic of repair can shift systems. Be ready for the long haul. Be willing to build systems that protect people you love and those you have never met. Show mercy where it's earned, and insist on accountability where it matters. Not every story ends in perfect closure. We still have arguments and missteps and nights where the old echo returns. But the ledger has shifted. The house feels quieter in a good way. The company works, and children in our scholarship program are learning to code with confidence. The most satisfying moment for me was not a headline or a boardroom coup. It was a young woman from our program sending me a message that read, simply, "I built my first app today." If you find yourself in the position I once was, overlooked at the family table, underestimated in the boardroom, ignored by the gatekeepers, know this: build quietly, learn patiently, and choose the moments that matter. If you must be strategic, be generous with the options you give others for reconciliation. If you must be firm, be fair. The sweetest victories are the ones that make a better world for other people, not just trophies that proclaim a personal triumph. And if you are watching this from a family business, or a life where you feel unseen, comment below and share your story. I read every one. Tell me how you survived, how you built, and what you did to find your place. Like, subscribe, and share if this resonated. Thank you for witnessing a story that began with neglect and ended, not with perfect reconciliation, but with a durable shift. The night I finally accepted being both the daughter and the owner, I learned that the true measure of success is the life you help others build.